once you have someone who's really brilliant that wants to join you in your mission, and you're a first-time founder, you should just default to giving them, in fact, even more. And I didn't do that. I gave them less. What it does is it effectively puts a sour taste on the mouth of the person who's joining you and taking a big risk. And that CTO ended up leaving and then launching their own company that then got acquired by Facebook. That was one decision I should have probably not made.
Yeah.
That was a mistake for sure.
Welcome to the Startup CEO Succession podcast, where we dive deep into the pivotal journey of founder CEOs who face the critical decision: should you continue leading your business or bring in a new leader? I'm your host, Evgeny Shechnev. As a founder coach and author specializing in CEO succession, I interview founders, chief executives, and investors who share their stories of navigating this transition. Today, I'm speaking with Dhruv Ghulati, founder and ex-CEO of Factmata, a startup that tackled misinformation using AI fact-checking. Dhruv's story is fascinating because it illustrates the challenges of navigating product and funding issues while being a solo founder and choosing the right moment and the right person to step aside. Enjoy the conversation. Good morning. Thank you so much for joining me for this conversation today. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. Yeah, excited to chat and
Yeah,
catch up.
looking forward to the conversation because you've got so much experience to share. But just to set up the conversation, can you give an overview of your journey at Factmata, your decision to step down as a CEO, and then we'll jump into it.
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, for those of if you don't know me, I'm the founder of a company called Factmata. Factmata was a company that came out of my thesis at University College London. This is back in 2015. I was studying effectively automated fact checking. I was trying to build models that could use natural language processing to fact check claims made about statistics in the world um, automatically using effectively semi-supervised methods in machine learning. And that thesis led on to me basically getting a grant from Google and the News Initiative to then build a product that could effectively try and automatically fact check claims of all sorts of types, not just statistical claims like claims about the GDP rate going up or claims about crime rates going up or immigration going up, but really just claims about anything that someone would make, whether it would be medical related claims or um, COVID related claims or claims about certain events having occurred or not. And then that led to a journey of me building a company backed by some incredibly amazing angel investors and a fund called Seed Camp to effectively try and tackle this really big problem of our times that was obviously still a big problem in our world today around disinformation, misinformation, hate speech, effectively, things on the internet that kind of might damage democratic values and values of truth in terms of society. And that was a 5 year long journey before I decided to sort of step down and hand over the reins to a new CEO.
Yeah. Well, if this problem was acute 5 or 10 years ago, it's only getting worse. That's what I'm thinking every time I open the news. The amount of, let's say, things that really need fact checking seems to be
Yeah.
increasing by the day.
Yes,
So
exactly.
you identified real problem. It was based on the research you've done at university. You built a company around it, raised money from impressive investors. What happened next?
I was 25 at the time of launching it was my first startup really. And now I'd be classed as a second time kind of founder. And the journey was a really interesting one. I was a solo founder. So most people try to build a company, obviously try and find the perfect co-founder to launch this business with them. My journey was very much around effectively already having this idea, obviously having my thesis written on the idea. So I'd been doing a lot of brainstorming and actually, you know, deep diving into the actual weeds of how you could go and solve this problem myself. And by the time of getting the grant from Google to launch this product, I'd already effectively had commitments from investors, and in fact already raised capital to effectively start building and hiring the team for this problem. Um, and that was, I think, the first kind of really interesting turning point for the business, even 2, 3 months in, because you then have the decision around, do you bring on a proper co-founder, even though you already raised capital? Or do you effectively hire someone and give them a large chunk of share options or shares, and get them on a shareholders agreement? And what I was advised at the time by our legal firm was it would be unwise to bring on someone and give them a big chunk of founder shares, class shares, and actually it'd be much easier to actually bring on a CTO, for example, and give them, let's say, 8 to 10% equity in terms of options. Now, I think that turned out to be a decision that I would probably not take on ever again. I think it's really important to incentivize people properly. Yeah.
That's super interesting. Can you share more of your thinking around this? Because you're not the only founder who faces this question. Can you share your thinking?
Yeah.
Why do you regret making this decision?
Yeah. So at the time of kind of really first having we had some press as well about our company, and we were in TechCrunch. We were in a bunch of interesting places. So we were getting a lot of inbound from um, basically people who wanted to work at the company and even join me in early stage as like a lead software engineer or a CTO. I'd put out an ad for this role, and I got to a stage where I met an amazing CTO, who had kind of done some work on the Wikipedia search engine in the early days of Wikipedia. They'd also been working in a startup that was doing biomedical work as well. So they were kind of perfect. They had this data and search background that was very relevant, and obviously with the Wikipedia experience, that was very relevant to this idea of facts and claims. So they were the perfect match for building this company with. And I remember that person telling me sort of like, this is what I want in terms of shares. And then I remember basically negotiating and saying, hey, you want this, but I'll give you this. That was kind of, I thought that would be a high enough amount, but still kind of like had this optionality for myself as a founder that didn't want to get burnt. I think that was a really bad decision, because once you have someone who's really brilliant, that wants to join you in your mission, and you're a first-time founder, you should just default to giving them, in fact, even more. And I remember this person telling me, like, you should just, whatever you ask more, ask whatever I ask for, you should give me more, because that's what they had done in their last startup. Um, and I didn't do that. I gave them less. I was offering that, and I think what it does is it effectively puts a sour taste on the mouth of the person who's joining you and taking a big risk. Um, and that CTO ended up leaving, actually, after just about kind of 9 months or something, and then launching their own company that then got acquired by Facebook. So it was an interesting, like, kind of kick in the teeth of like, wow, I should have been. That was one decision I should have probably not made.
Yeah.
That was a mistake for sure.
Yeah. So it sounds like the CTO was approaching it more from a perspective of I'm also an entrepreneur. I should be treated as a co-founder, even if I'm a late co-founder. I have so much to bring to the table. And
Correct.
you were approaching it more from a mindset of, yes, you are an early employee, super valuable, but still you are joining something that exists, and therefore it requires a different equity stake and options rather than shares.
Yeah, and I think that's probably something that, as you say, is a lot of people make a mistake of, because um, when you're young and you have very confident about your idea, you have this kind of strong mindset that which I definitely had at that time, where it was kind of like, yeah, great, but like I know how to run this, I know how to play this game, and like almost in a way that like I was on a mission and a train on myself. And I think one of the things that I learned on that was sort of like how to bring other people on the journey more.
Yeah.
I've learned through the last kind of few
Yeah.
years.
And this makes me think that I made a very similar mistake at Makers. I hired an early team member within, I think, the first few months, and we didn't even think much about equity. We kind of put some number into the document, but neither of us realized how important and transformative he would turn out to be for the business. And by the time it became obvious the business was larger and fixing the equity stake retrospectively was
Yeah.
really difficult for all kinds of reasons. And that's was a mistake I regret.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that was the beginning of the journey at Factmata. What happened over the next few years?
Yeah, so over the next few years, we the first thing that we did with Fat Matter was basically as basically had this really strong team of individuals um, who had been hired through various places. We had a team of about 10 of us, very technical team, primarily research engineers, machine learning engineers, and I sort of had this hypothesis that the first market to go after would be the ad tech market. So the use case there would be um, sort of advertisers did not want to advertise on pages that would be deemed to be propaganda or spreading disinformation. And so we would want to be able to classify web pages that were potentially of that nature, and then give it to try to sell to what are known as sort of DSPs, demand side platforms, uh, who effectively would then make or even supply side platforms, which are effectively in the ad tech world, the platforms that hold the inventory of URLs um, to advertise on. And then there's the advertisers as well who are deciding and forming the budgets. So amongst those three players, DSPs, SSPs, supply platforms, and then advertisers, we were trying to figure out the right entry point to sell this initial prototype that was effectively a classifier on web pages for propaganda score and a disinformation score on URLs. So we went about this process. We had a really lean team. I was kind of driving primarily most of the sales, and but I also had a business development hire that we had who was also in the ad tech world, and really helping us get conversations in place with these platforms and networks. We had about 6 pilots or 7 pilots in place. One of them was a paid pilot as well. And basically, this was maybe about 8, 9 months into founding. We were hoping that all of those pilots would close. And the fact that we had all of these pilots, 6 or 7 pilots, each one of those would be 200 to 300K in deal value. If all of them had closed, we could basically hit our million ARR mark and raise our Series A. What ended up happening was that none of those pilots closed. And it was very clear that effectively that this was really worrying, that we had this really strong hypothesis. Our customers were really excited to give us the data, see what we could do with it. As happened in the whole fake news misinformation space, like everyone was really excited to solve this problem, and we were like the hot startup that was, basically one of the only solution providers. But we didn't kind of factor in that a lot of these kind of customers at that point, it wasn't the most hair on fire problem for them. It was kind of a let's show a nice demo to our advertising customers and see what's possible, rather than they're going to pay for it.
Yeah.
And so that led to the first wave of the company, where effectively a lot of people at that point in the team got disillusioned. We ran out of funding effectively, and I had to then raise funding for the next phase, which was the pivot. And almost more than 50% of the team ended up leaving at that point. And that was a really big blow for me as a founder.
Yeah. So it sounds like you built a valuable solution that worked, but it wasn't solving a pain point strong enough for your customers that they
Yes,
would commit to paying you. And then it looked
exactly.
so it looked great, it worked, but it was more of a vitamin than a painkiller.
Correct. Yeah, exactly. And I think another mistake was like we also, apart from our B2B hypotheses, I decided to also think about a B2C platform that could effectively help us gather the idea was to build a flywheel where effectively we would get training data and human beings labeling articles as propaganda or hate speech and so on. Um, and naturally through a workflow, kind of like a social network where they were tagging articles that they thought were hate speech and commenting about them. And while they were tagging them, we would use that as training data for our system. That was the kind of idea of this human in the loop flywheel. Um, but obviously, it was very hard to, with a small team, have a group of people working in a B2C platform and a group of people working in a B2B platform. And there was just not enough time to actually think about how the system kind of hooked up together. Um, and so effectively, the next wave was then almost rehiring, finding new people. CTO had left, and then brought on another CTO who was again brilliant, had a lot of experience in um, you know impact companies, and had also built a lot of data engineering for those impact companies. Um, and then brought on a bunch of other people to kind of take on this new pivot that was more in the line of effectively selling to news organizations, and then also exploring new avenues beyond the ad tech space. So, for example, government was one, finance that we were looking at, where you could score articles for like this type of information because financial firms, for example, want to make sure that they can trust the news that they're getting. Um, and insurance firms might want to get um, some tracking on the disinformation score of um, articles about companies they were looking to insure. So effectively, the company pivoted from a let's get some URLs and wait to score them and give them back to let's proactively monitor the internet and proactively give insights that could help us kind of win deals and sales. And so the company then evolved with a completely entire new team, completely new CTO, um, uh, different type of area to go after. So the expertise of people that we needed was different. And then that kicked off another year and a half of a journey of trying to win deals in that space. We had kind of 2 or 3 paid pilots. We managed to in that year probably make about 100K, 150K. Nothing really kind of landed in terms of a major contract. During this whole process, because we had raised about $1 million at the beginning, and then we had that first crash in the 9 months when none of the pilots closed, I then had to raise the next round of funding that was a little bit smaller than $1 million. Um, and smaller than $1 million with a machine learning company does not last very long, particularly in London. So um, effectively, we were constantly running out of money, right? Like I was having to go to New York, go to San Francisco, take meetings with really big investors that were really interested in what we were doing, but the traction that we had was just not there. And so it was this kind of journey of just like raising every 6 months, raising every 12 months. And you can imagine you're raising every 6 months of the course of 4 years.
It's so
I had
distracting.
probably 10 rounds of closing money in my journey. And I think what was really challenging for me, which I learned, is as a solo founder, um, you're flying out to San Francisco. The team is sitting there in London. And sure, you're on Slack and you're kind of messaging people and having calls, but you're really not connected to what's going on in the office. And it got very lonely for me. And I started to almost get paranoid about like, does the team like me? Does the team like, what are they thinking about what I'm doing? Are they trusting me to close this funding round? Um, I remember going to Web Summit and pitching on Web Summit, and the team was definitely there and like helping with the demo and so on, but I didn't know what was going on in the office. And I felt like we had gathered this team of people that didn't know each other, right, and hadn't worked together before, which effectively is a company. But without a co-founder and someone to speak to about this, it became very lonely and kind of it's sort of hard to build trust. And I almost sort of was almost as a CEO trying to almost find people within the company that could kind of lean on, um, have honest conversations about with them. But the challenge is they're not co-founders, right? So it became very challenged because if you reveal something to someone about how you're feeling about the funding round, that then spreads to the office, and
Yeah.
you know it can create this kind of strange dynamic amongst the CEO and the rest of the team.
Yeah. Yeah. So in effect, you try to do two full-time difficult jobs at the same time, running the business and trying to figure out the pivot, which is more than enough on its own, plus fundraising, which is again a full-time job because it's so different, so distracting, so emotionally draining.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Plus
it was,
also operating and managing the team, and having one-on-ones with people and making sure that they knew what to do. And
yeah,
um
running the business.
yeah.
Yeah.
And that's really hard. It's really, really hard to kind of like do that without a co-founder.
Yeah.
That's a real challenge. I then tried to hire kind of and this relates to the kind of like topic of this kind of podcast right there. I tried to hire like a chief of staff. First, I had a kind of like an EA, like a virtual assistant that would help manage things and organize things, and she was brilliant. Um, but then I hired a chief of staff figure who was also, that was a really good decision to try and bring on someone who could be a shield between myself and the rest of the team. Um, and I could kind of check in with her on a daily basis and sort of say, here's what's top of my mind. Here's what I think are the problems we need to think about. Here's what's coming up on the horizon that I feel like we haven't done enough thinking around, or we haven't got this product launched. Like kind of like my top five like hair on fire problems, and then she would go and kind of speak to the team and come like present a plan uh, about what we were going to do about those things. And that was a really good kind of sense that I had not learned to do, of like, hey, it's actually I need someone to kind of like manage the operations of this business. It's a really beneficial, and it helps me get a pulse for like how the team is feeling. It also gets someone that like it allows me to kind of dump the top things on my mind in a structured way, so that then that can be translated to actions for the team.
So in a way, you solved the problem. Maybe not completely, but it helped you to address. It is part of the challenge of being the only founder of the business.
Yes, yeah, that was a really, really good move. That was probably about 2 years in. Then what happened was the person that we needed in that role, particularly like what investors were looking for, was probably someone a bit more senior, um, who had got experience in running and operating businesses, and not just a kind of support for me as a CEO, but actually like a real driver of strategy and so on. Um, so then we realized actually we need someone who's in that kind of role, and then that started off this period of then hiring someone else after about, this is a kind of year three, who would be a head of product. Um, so again, in with the team, thinking about the product direction, which at this point was the monitoring tool, and being really a great team leader, right? Someone who could kind of, while I'm out fundraising San Francisco, flying around the place, able to manage and keep the team happy and kind of clear on direction. And that was, again, a really golden period for the company. We ended up closing a couple of deals. We had some recurring contracts, our first recurring revenues. Um, and really, I felt at that point after year three, four, like this was sort of, we had a brilliant product. Customers were loving it. Um, Again, early market, right? The fake news disinformation space was still getting to this point where companies were interested in learning what's out there rather than closing contracts because they needed to track disinformation. Um, and we signed some really interesting kind of contracts with people that we were getting regular kind of feedback from customers around. Okay, we've given you a report of what's happening around COVID misinformation. What do you think? What other insights would be valuable? Do you want the data in real time? How many seats do you need? Um, and we had that kind of feedback loop in place, which is really important in startups. Um, and I think the key thing at that point was kind of realizing that I was kind of watching how all these brilliant people that I'd brought in were running the business, and I'd already effectively made some mistakes around, um, basically also mismanaging like certain people and like not realizing their full potential, not giving them agency on what they should be doing, and then having some quite a high like employee churn. To then realizing like actually the people that I'm bringing on, particularly this head of product that I brought on, the team loves working with that person, and the product suddenly like doing really, really well. And as a CEO and a founder, when you're sort of founder, you're so close to the product. That's the aspect that you love because that's the vision that you talk about. But you may not, we may have the initial vision, but you may not have the time to actually think about the nuances of how that could be executed and practically built. And you need someone else to be doing that. And it kind of clicked for me after almost 3 years,
Yeah.
sadly, of delegation is key, right? I really need to just like think about the right people and just let them do it.
Yeah. Yeah. So you started building your senior team, the executive team
Yes.
that you were able to delegate to,
Yes.
and uh, it's probably, at least in my experience, it's probably inevitable that in the beginning we need to do it ourselves as founders to figure out what needs to be delegated, how it needs to be delegated, what good looks like. But at some point, yes, the time comes when we start delegating more and more, and the executive team starts really running the rest of the business, so that you as a CEO could focus on your core tasks.
Yeah. And I think what started to happen that was really interesting was I would sort of go into meetings, and I was, as a sort of founder, I was used to just like directing the show, um, getting everyone together in a room and being like, guys, we're doing this. Any questions, any thoughts? Do we agree? This kind of thing. But I was getting to a point after 2, 3 years where people who joined were seriously questioning me, and I was sort of, they were sort of like publicly, like actually like, hey, this is wrong, actually, Drew. Like we shouldn't be doing this, or like, I think there's no data to back up that assumption, or this kind of thing. And I was kind of realizing like, hold on, actually, I don't have all the answers at all here, um, and the team is crying out for agency here, right? They really have done their research. They're sitting in the office while I'm away, and they've gathered new data. They've spoken to other people. They've spoken to customers, and again, it was this slow and gradual, pretty too slow learning that I may not be the best person to operate and think about this business. The other thing that I realized was, as a founder of this company, when I first set up the business, the ambitions were so large. The goal was, we had two goals, huge ambitious goals. One of them was with our scoring function for the quality of online content. Um, we could effectively integrate with Google search or integrate with the Facebook newsfeed and rank or de-rank content according to the goodness and quality of that information. That was one goal. The second goal was, actually, if we built a social network where people were commenting on content, that would be even more popular than Twitter, right? So these were really, really like huge, ambitious goals.
I was about to say, it's like they're huge goals, very interesting, very ambitious. But like
Yeah,
building a social network is not a small endeavor.
correct. And I think the realization there was, after raising $1 million, the first pivot not working, and then saying, okay, I believe in this. Let's raise another kind of like million and go for this again. And then being hit again by the fact that nothing closed. I kind of realized that actually the first vision that I had, the thing that really excited me as a founder, we were now going into this kind of media monitoring world where we were in the same category of tools like Hootsuite or Talkwalker or Brandwatch, which were effectively kind of interesting tools, but they were helping brands to monitor information about their companies or products. And at some point we were even pivoting to helping finding insights about skincare cream for L'Oreal, right? Because we thought, that's going to make money, and people want that kind of insights layer. They may not want to know if the thing's fake, but at least we can track the claims and what's being made about these products. And I kind of realized, like, do I really want to be building a product now that's going to analyze product insights for? And I could feel like I was pitching these things. I remember having a meeting with, I think it was Reckitt Benckiser, right, that makes kind of sprays and cleaning products, and going to the office of that company and having a chat with the insights team. They were really excited about our product. But then the team that I was going back and saying, hey guys, we've got this amazing potential pilot with Reckitt Benckiser, they had joined for a completely different reason. They had joined for the mission of misinformation, disinformation detection. That's why they joined this crazy early stage company with like 600, 700K of funding and a 10-person team. They didn't want to be doing product insights. And I just found that keeping the team engaged and keeping them aligned on the bigger vision was very hard flying around the world, trying to raise funding and not being close to like building that relationship with my team members.
Yeah, especially as the company is going through a pivot, searching for a better product market fit and trying new ideas. So what happens what happened next? Where did
Yeah,
you
so what
take
happened
the
next
company?
was effectively we'd gone through this path. I'd say we had a lot of employee churn. I think that was also partly driven by like I learned a lot of things as a CEO and as a manager mistakes I'd made, but then there was also the fact that we constantly were running out of money. So someone who had joined, you know, effectively was looking at 4 or 5 months of runway in the company. And I was always very transparent about those things because I had that belief. But at some point, any human being is going to be like, hey, I'm going to join this company, see what's going to happen. But if we haven't raised funding in the next 3 or 4 months, I'm going to be looking for other jobs. And I realized that it was so draining for me to like spend so much time hiring people, really believing in them, giving them kind of high responsibility, um, hoping that things would magically come up with a new product feature or a deal would land from one of these pilots. But it takes time. It's a hard machine learning problem. Um, I think at the end of the day, if we had sort of 3 years of funding, like from the straight from the get go, I think it would have been really good for the company. But it was this constant uphill battle, and I was sort of priding myself personally on resilience, like a lot of my peers and people in my close friend network, sort of admiring how resilient I was and this ability to never give up. And that kind of keeps you going as a founder and a person for a while. But after a while, you start to kind of just realize that like you're not driven by like other people's opinion of you. And you have to feel for yourself if you're making the right call and rationally if the actual idea is going to work. Um, the other, I think, call that we made, key thing in the course of Factmata, the company, was Factmata was one of we were one of the first companies, as I said, like tackling misinformation, disinformation. And at that time, it was one of the hottest topics there. And we had a lot of interest from some of the big social media companies who were interested in actually potentially looking at us from an acquisition standpoint. Now, what I had this conversation going on, and then I also had most of our investors talking about revenue, revenue, revenue. And so I was kind of like never made a decision on those things. I was trying to win revenue and deals, but then I was also trying to think about like this acquisition strategy and so on. And I think what the lesson there is actually probably for the business of misinformation, disinformation, it might have been wiser to just get acquired by one of those players for our team and technology and some of the amazing things that we built. But because we had this revenue angle, we were taking shortcuts on the actual technology sometimes to close
Yeah.
deals and so on, move fast. Um,
So it sounds like you chose a valuable or an interesting problem to solve, but this kind of a problem required more capital to really do it justice. And because you
Absolutely.
didn't have enough capital, you were constantly distracted by fundraising and didn't have enough freedom to operate.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
this in turn prevented you from getting traction required to raise significant amounts of capital.
Yeah, and I think that was the gist of it. And I kind of personally we were getting to this point where we were even like having to like we were again still operating. We still had we were still going concern. We had lots of different pilots going on. So we're never at risk in that sense of like this is completely like no one cares about what we're doing. We had a lot of interest. But at that point we just chucked in so many different ideas and pivots and asked sort of had bills from contractors and bills from some recruiter lying around. And it was just getting to this point where personally, I was like, I just cannot personally handle the stress and the mental fatigue um, of this. I had one crucial moment for me where I decided that I needed to find a CEO to take on the business. And that was when I went to San Francisco to fundraise yet again for like the sixth, seventh time. And just feeling this sense of like I was pitching to investors and they'd heard the story before, right? And I think the VC world is quite small. That you kind of have one or two shots to pitch to a certain VC. And if you go back to them after 2 years, even though they said, come back to us with some more learnings and traction, really they've already made their mind up because they have a CRM. And there's kind of gossip going on in the VC office and the deal flow room. And so I just felt like there's nothing actually we can do right now to um, to kind of fix things, right? Like it's kind of a timing thing. Maybe this idea is too early. We'd exhausted so much in terms of exploring different areas of this. And I think that's one thing I'm really proud about. Um, that I just realized that actually, and then the final thing is we were now in the PR space. So we kind of pivoted and that was where we were getting traction, where we're helping PR firms track risks for their clients, like track the risks of COVID, what was being discussed around climate change, for example, the risks of the U.S. elections were happening as well, like what is happening around the U.S. elections, what claims people are making, who are the key influencers driving these narratives forward, are people pro or against this particular stance on this specific issue. And I thought, look, if there is anything I learned, like I hadn't succeeded in the ad tech world, I hadn't succeeded in the news world, um, meaning like there was no breakout revenue, exponential growth. I didn't have backgrounds in those spaces, right, to win deals. And so I tried to find a new replacement CEO, and I put them on board, and I said, look, I am probably going to be leaving at some point, and I'm looking for a successor. Let's work really closely together, and I want you to kind of clean up the company, clean up sort of what's there right now, help me close these deals and get me to the Series A point. Here's all the learnings that we've had. Here's all the mistakes that we've made. Here's all the challenges that still exist. Take this on. And we hired someone who was sort of ex-Google in this kind of phase of finding this replacement CEO. And we worked super closely together. And I sort of learned from my first 4 years back of sort of hiring my first CTO. Like, I really want to trust this person. We went on walks in the park and we sat for hours talking and debating about like where this company should go. And I sort of made it very clear to this person that like, I want you to run this thing, right? Like, you know, this is your chance to kind of take this as your baby and figure it out. I think the lesson from that first experiment was sort of like, again, really brilliant person and great person to work with, but um, because of the life of this company that gone through sort of almost 10 funding rounds, huge amounts of employee churn and pilots here, pilots there, learning from this industry, that industry, a lot for someone to process and clean up. And it's very hard if you haven't gone through the nuts and bolts of running a company and restructuring it, because that's what it needed at that point. It needed restructure. And so just someone who's ex-Google may not be the right person for this. And that was very clear in sort of how they were sort of thinking about things, which was very like perfect and trying to get the right structure together. But it was sort of like, yeah, we need something moving fast. And so, yeah, and then I ended up then finding a second attempt at this transition, and that ended up working really, really well. We can talk about.
Yeah, but before we get to that, I'm also noticing that you didn't decide to sell the company yourself. You didn't go into the full let's try and acquire mode. You try to find someone to take the company from you.
Yeah, I think what I realized is that I, as a founder, was personally like interested in product and technology, and like I'd come from a machine learning background, so the types of things that I was kind of like pitching the company as was like as a deep tech play. And we had that interest from those kind of like big social media players, but that time had already passed, right? Like we'd had those discussions, and they were like, "This is really cool, but um, we may not be sure that we want to buy a company like this yet, but let's keep in touch." So I'd had those discussions on the deep tech side, but then it was clear the next acquisition opportunities that we had would be much more in the sort of PR media monitoring space, which is completely different, right? Sort of media tech people, ad tech people. Um, and so I wanted someone who is connected in that space, and knows how to operate that market, which even today is a very people driven market, right? You need to know people in that space.
Yeah,
People talk a lot. There's
relationships.
a small relationship. So I thought, let's find someone who's experienced in that world. And the person I ended up bringing on, like, was super experienced in PR, and had also done work for the UK government in terms of disinformation narratives, right, in Afghanistan. So they had serious experience in specifically the sort of problem space that we were going after. And it was really clear that this person was mega action orientated, right? They were taking control of things. They had already produced plans. They were sort of working nonstop in the background to kind of get things ready and cleaned up. And I was kind of amazed very quickly after 2, 3 months that this person was really driving things forward,
Yeah.
right?
So it sounds
Um,
like this person really checked a lot of boxes, relevant experience
yes,
in the field, understands the problem domain, and
yes,
has an action bias, which matters
yes.
so much in startups.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think we just got along really well. I think it was the first time where I really felt like, wow, this is someone that I really gel with and I connect with, and they get me, they get the challenges that I'm facing. They were not scared by like what had happened to the company so far. They were just very focused on the future and what they needed to do.
Yeah. And how did you formulate the goal for this person? What did success look like to them?
So I think the way that I phrased it to this person was, look, this is my baby. This is my journey, right? It's been exhausting, but you have in your career like done work in PR for almost 10, 20 years. You've done all this amazing experience, but you haven't really, and it done some work in the tech space, but you've never run a company. Here's your shot to run this company, and I want to give this to you. And I want you to, I think you'll be better placed than me to run it. And I'd say the goal there was first to do the restructuring and cleanup, so get a stable team in place, take our existing product that has some recurring revenue and get it to, 1 million of recurring revenue, which we were still at that point of finding that inflection point. We were almost there. I feel like we had some, again, customers that loved us, and get it to that point, and then move the company to acquisition, after a year or two, or whenever we get to a point where the product has, 5 or 6 recurring, really solid customers using us. And that was the mandate basically. But I think the other mandate that was interesting in my position was like, I was ready to step down even after 3 or 4 months of feeling, okay, this person can run this show. Um, I didn't want to go through to being in the company while the CEO was there. And I don't know if that's something that
Yeah.
people in your podcast have, um, had to go through as well, like whether they leave early or whether they stay on.
There are all kinds of situations. Some people
Yeah,
leave immediately, some people have a long handover period and then leave, some people stay as a part of the team. Every such
yeah,
situation is so unique. But what about you? What about your own thoughts on what you wanted to do after you found that second person to lead the company? What was next for you?
yeah. So I think for me, I at that point was very much looking to kind of leave the company, and I was very burnt out, stressed, and I kind of wanted to basically get to the point where I was confident enough for this person to completely take over. And I think for me, I was honestly looking for a job that would sort of give me sort of just a stable salary, and time to think. And I think the route that I had for myself, I was thinking through different options about what I would do post founder life, and trying to also think about what my career looked like, right? Like sort of when you're a founder, you're doing so many different types of things. It's very hard to understand what actual skill sets you have. And I was sort of thinking through how I'd position myself from a career perspective and a role perspective. Um, and so I started some interviews with different companies, and um, basically, in terms of the CEO, I'd brought on, really had shown kind of real value in terms of just getting things organized, meeting with the team, already handling sprints that we were having with our team, thinking through different, coming up to deal calls that we were having with different customers, um, and design partners to try and shape the product. So I was very confident at that point that he was the right person to take it over. Um, and in terms of the actual transition itself, that was around, I think, March 2021. By that point, I had already done lots of different interviews with different companies, and decided to make almost like an instant switch where I had the role lined up, and the CEO that I brought on was basically then announced that he would be taking over. Um, and I think in terms of the actual communication to the investors around this transition and so on, that was a quite an abrupt thing, I'd say. Like we probably sort of told a few people within the investor board who were close to the company, but we actually had about 45 different angel investors. So one of the challenges that I had faced in my company was around just communicating with all these different investors, different voices, different opinions on things. And I kind of decided that actually the best thing to do in that exit would just be say like, this is what's happening, and I am the sole founder, and this is the decision that I think is the right for the company and the board and so on.
Yeah.
And so yeah, made that transition, and then we can talk about kind of what happened next. But the mandate, to your question, sort of what was the mandate of that CEO? It was really about sort of bringing the company, getting our current pilots and the customers we were speaking to converted into recurring revenue, and reaching about $1 million in recurring revenue so that we could kind of push towards an acquisition at that point.
Yeah. And before we get to your career, what happened with the business? So that acquisition, how did it all turn out?
Yeah, so basically we started kind of really honing in and improving the product. There were a few things that we needed to fix around our monitoring tool. We were sort of effectively had this SaaS-based dashboard that any client could upload a topic that they wanted to track, and they would basically be able to set up sort of daily reporting on what are the key narratives evolving in that topic itself. And it was a step up from existing media monitoring tools at that time. And I was personally quite proud about the product that we built. It was actually a really good product. I think the CEO brought that product to kind of finalization stage where there was, a really clear, like these pilots basically converted, right? So we had kind of 3 or 4 paying customers. And then that was probably after like 3-4 months. And then after like a year, we got to about almost 8-9 paying customers. And, we reached sort of almost that $1 million revenue mark. And then effectively what we'd done after about 8 months, we actually hired, that CEO had hired some old contacts who was sort of M&A advisors, that actually I was initially kind of a bit opposed to, but it turned out to be a really good decision. And they were sort of looking into potential buyers for the business. And there was probably about 6 to 12 months in additional after that, where we are effectively doing lots of due diligence, documenting all of our technology, documenting what was there with the business, what the assets were, cleaning up our accounting, cleaning up everything to make it ready for a sale. And there were lots of different calls and negotiations. Obviously, by that point, I had left the business, but I was very close to the CEO and supporting him and advising him in that process. The team got to about 10-ish people, and then we got acquired, signed the paperwork with this company called Decision.
Yeah. And I'm curious, what made you initially skeptical about hiring M&A advisors?
I think the skepticalness sort of came from just I had been so burnt from paying so many different people as a first-time founder, you know, in the business. Accountants, we had four different accountants. None of them were great. Lawyers, we probably had three or four different lawyers in iterations. Every time we had to sort of collect the same information, which was sort of, information about our different convertible notes and deal documents. And so I was just kind of like, I just didn't want to spend more money on this. And I think we were very strong as a business in having contacts with firms, right? Sort of done a lot of networking, and I just thought, hey, if I just ping a couple of people and start conversations with the founders of these potential buyers, I'd be in a good place. But I think the lesson was actually like it's good to have an actual official way of communicating with those. It sort of makes you look more serious, and it makes you sort of have the right type of information for that sort of lingo, language, structure of how you send documents and send emails. Sort of says, hey, we're ready to get bought,
Yeah.
rather than, hey, let's have a chat about stuff and catch up,
Yeah, like we're really
that kind of
serious
thing.
about it. Yeah. And so the company got to an exit. You hired the CEO with a mandate to grow and sell the business, and that's exactly what happened.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, it was a really good, and it was really nice to sign that documentation. I got announced from TechCrunch, which is always nice. And the challenge was also like as we were selling the business, I had a target price in mind. I spent so long on the business, and I felt like we had a lot of positive things going on. But when we were going into acquisition, that was around June 2022. At that point, there was actually a big market crash, like in the startup world. Like people basically, I don't know if you remember, but sort of like a lot of valuations were going down, and investors were sort of starting to say like AI was kind of bullshit, and like we needed to have a bit more guardrails on what was being invested in, and so the price just sort of, and because also the buyer sort of knew that we were kind of running out of funds at that point, it was kind of, they were very sneaky and sort of like squeezing that out. But for me, I was kind of like, look, an exit is an exit. As long as it gives the existing team who are there work so hard, you know, imagine they joined a company with 3 or 4 months of runway and almost no sight of like additional funding, and have to kind of make all of their salaries from it deals, right? It's a big risk for anyone. So I really want to make sure that team got good deals out of it. Um, and I don't know exactly what the deals were, to be honest, but I know that they did okay on that.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was the kind of outcome, and it felt really good.
Yeah. As you said, an exit is an exit. And
Yes.
what was next for you? So you said you've been interviewing and you started right after you left the company.
Yeah, so it's been a really interesting journey around like how that's kind of evolved. In all honesty, I found it quite difficult to integrate back into the job market initially. I joined a couple of companies. I sort of left them after 3 months. I was struggling to go straight from being a solo founder into being in a company. There's different ways of operating. The pace is much slower. You're not sort of like leading things, right? You're sort of a small cog in a big machine, and just asked to do your job. And in fact, if you go beyond your job, it can actually really harm you instead of rewarding you. So that mechanism I've had to sort of slowly, lean into and learn, um, and sort of, another aspect is sort of being more specific around the job that you're doing and being very deep there rather than being shallow but doing lots of different things. Um, but yeah, after a couple of attempts, I then I was traveling the world. I was living in different countries, spending a month in Italy. I was spending a month in Portugal, spending a month in Mexico, trying to gain like consulting gigs. And then I sort of realized that actually, like, yes, it's nice to get some fresh air and breathe a little bit. But actually, I do want to get some structure. So after about 8, 9 months, I sort of landed a role at Onfido, um, and that gave me a really interesting job in AI product management. So my remit there was sort of leading the AI fraud team and trying to build ML models to detect document fraud. Far cry
That's
from the sort of
that's cool.
mission-driven, changing the world of politics and changing how truth works online to detecting, driver's licenses and extracting text and understanding forgeries. But there was a linkage there because fake news, in a way, is all about finding bad actors and bad content, and fraud, in a way, is quite similar, right? You're trying to find sparse, rare instances of things that might screw things up. Um, yeah, so I did about a year and a half, almost 2 years on Fido, and now I work at Uber. I've been there for about a year and a half as well, and I got headhunted for a role in Europe, basically leading the applied AI product team. So I'm the first applied AI product manager within this unit called Uber AI.
Oh, sounds really cool. And
Yeah.
uh, did your background as a founder CEO help you, as in were you recruited at Onfido or at Uber because of your experience as a CEO, or was it seen as irrelevant?
It's a very good question. I think one of the things, I definitely feel like my recruiting managers and my people who hired me sort of took a risk, right? Because, um, I didn't have at that point sort of a CV that says, 3 years at Facebook and 3 years at Google, and one of these kind of sort of very clear path, right? APM program, computer science at Stanford, right? Like the perfect CV. I think in a startup like Onfido, maybe that was okay. It was a Series E startup, in London. Not many people have that Stanford CS plus Google and Facebook background, anyways. But definitely the role at Uber, I think, sort of the hiring manager, the team there. Uber is a very dynamic company, and I've really enjoyed my time there so far. It's a really interesting, fast-paced company that um, values, I think, people who kind of think outside the box and move fast and execute. Um, and so yeah, I think definitely it was a challenge in terms of interviews and getting ready for that process. But I think, and I've definitely made some mistakes along the way around kind of like, I don't know like, also I'd never been a product manager really, realistically. So I was selling my experience as a founder as, actually, because I was a solo founder, I was effectively managing the product. So and I also managed a team of 20 people. So I was sort of like, hey, I'm a product manager who's managed these engineers, but realistically, like, they weren't really they were all my reports, right? So whereas actually as a product manager, no one's actually reporting to you. So it's way harder actually, to get things moving and ship things.
Yeah, it's all about the influence and building relationships and
Yes,
yeah, understanding everyone's perspectives and priorities.
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So now that you look back at your journey of the last several years, going from a startup to having worked by now, what has been 3, 4
It's
years,
been about 3 years, three and a bit
three,
years.
yeah, 3 and a bit years
Almost, yeah.
in large companies.
Yes.
Is there any advice you would offer to founders who are maybe in your situation a few years ago, if you think about still running Factmata? What would you like
Yeah.
founders in that moment to know?
Yeah, I actually wrote about sort of moving from founder to product manager, but I think your question is much more about what do you do when you think about, you just left your company, you've transitioned your company over, and what do you think about? Um, really depends on what you're seeking in your life. I personally am of the opinion that you should take a break. Some people go off to just do the next thing, immediately. And I think the challenge I find is, like, people who do that, there's sort of this is your life, right? Like, it's not there's and I think people get very pressured by external influence around what what's the market going to think you're doing, right? What are you going to post on LinkedIn around what you're up to now? Okay, you've been traveling the world, and there are definitely people in the startup world who looked down upon it. I've definitely seen it, right? What's this guy doing now? What's he actually doing now? Is he sort of chilling in Bali or something? Like, okay, like I can just forget about them, right? Like and so there is definitely that sort of syndrome where you feel like a bit of like an imposter, like your company, you moved up away from it, you're away from the sort of action, you're now back in the boring corporate world where sort of I definitely had this sort of like missing the energy of the startup world and like my startup friends and that what was going on there. But I really think that if you take a mature decision, you need to have energy when you do your company. And I think I've really enjoyed the period of gaining skills, um, saving up cash, and sort of really getting ready for the next stage where I've thought about what's the next thing. Um, and I think you should take decisions based on like how you feel in your body, rather than what looks good to other people or like what should look good on your CV, right? And I think for me also, like I had not had that prior to founding my business. I had not had those 10 years of a career really. And so for me, there's a chance to sort of build that a little bit before going into the next thing. But definitely see myself going back into founder life maybe at some point, and but I want to do it with the right resources and the right frameworks and backbone, right? Not sort of 25K loan on my head, and, hanging around in coffee shops and bedrooms trying to get things done. And I'd rather do it with like robust, give myself the optimal chance of success.
Yeah. And it sounds like you are taking a few very valuable lessons out of your Factmata experience.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Dhruv, as we're preparing to wrap up our conversation today, is there anything else that you would like to share with our listeners?
No, I think from a founder, moving from founder to sort of getting into the sort of job world, I think it's been a real journey. I would say again, don't lose the spark that you have as a founder. When you go into corporate, um, you'll meet some interesting people, but there'll be maybe 5% of the people who are in these corporates who still want to go out there and build a company, right? And I think it's really important to keep that energy and spark alive, um, as you think about your move and your transition to kind of regroup. Always keep that longer term view for yourself. It would be my advice.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing. It's been a real pleasure having you on the podcast.
Thanks so much, Evgeny.
Thank you. To wrap up our conversation today, I would like to highlight a few points. The first one is about the difficulty of hiring early stage talent in startups. Because in hindsight, Dhruv wishes that he went against the advice of his lawyers and were more generous towards a critical early stage team member. Because after all, generosity and trust matter a great deal in startups. Secondly, Dhruv spoke very openly about his experience as a solo founder, especially as he was navigating product and fundraising challenges. Running a startup is difficult enough when you've got one or two co-founders, but it's even more difficult when you're a solo founder and all of this is on your shoulders. And lastly, I'm very grateful to Dhruv for speaking so openly and candidly about the process and the mechanics of choosing the right person and the right moment to step down. His intention was to find someone else to run the company and ultimately to sell it. And with hindsight, it worked out exactly as he wished. So I hope you enjoyed the story and found it interesting. And don't forget to like and subscribe on the platform of your choice, and speak to you soon.